Turbocharged engines. They used to be a thing of the past reserved for performance cars, but slowly they started coming back, and now they're becoming the mainstream gasoline engine is a turbocharged engine. In today's video, I'm going to share with you 5 things that you should do to prolong the life of your turbo and your engine that is turbocharged right after this. Before we get started with the important things you should know, what is a turbocharger? In case you're not familiar with that, let me briefly talk about what turbocharging is in a very simple fashion, but the reality they're a lot more complicated than that. Go back to the very basics. Gasoline engines. You need air and you need gasoline, and the most thing important in air is the oxygen. And you need something to ignite this mixture, which is the spark plugs. The more air and gasoline you put, the more power you produce. It's as simple as that. It's a lot more complicated, but that is the simple theory here. You can easily add more fuel. Injector, just let it spray more fuel. But you can't force more air in other than what the engine is naturally going to take in until turbocharging came about. Basically, what charging or charged engines are, you are forcing air into the engine so you can add more fuel, you have more air or more oxygen, and more fuel, you have more power. That's the basic idea of charging an engine. Now, turbocharging, the exhaust has flow. It's creating airflow. They put a little impeller on the exhaust. The exhaust, as it comes out of the engine, is going to spin that impeller. And that impeller is connected to another impeller that's going to, kind of like a compressor. It's going to compress the air and it's going to send it back into the engine. That is the very basic premise of this turbo. Couple things about the turbo, though, that most people are not aware of. Turbos can spin at RPMs that are unbelievably high. I mean, you rev this car up at 4,000 or 5,000 RPM. This turbo could be spinning at 25,000, 30,000 RPMs. That's how much these little guys spin, the speeds they spin at, which means they generate heat, which means there is a slew of things that come from that heat they generate and the load that they have, which is going to take us to the first thing you should know and you should do to take care of your turbocharged engine. This is the most important thing about turbocharged engines: oil maintenance. Folks, in normal cars, you should change your oil on time. You should use quality oil. You should not follow these long recommended intervals and that cause all kinds of issues down the road. But with turbocharged engines, that becomes very, very important. The reason for that is, aside from this oil cooling the engine, lubricating everything in this, it's actually used to cool the turbo and lubricate it as well. The problem with turbos is they create so much heat and they have a lot of friction and they spin at very high speeds. Oil contamination is the #1 thing that kills turbos. And the second thing that turbos do is they heat up that oil a lot. So you're going to wear that oil and wear the additives much more rapidly in a turbo engine. Folks, I cannot emphasize how important it is that you're on top of your oil changes with a turbo engine and shorten these intervals, folks. I see manufacturers with turbo engines, 15,000 mile interval on that oil change. I don't care how good that oil is, please don't do that. If you're in Toyota or Lexus land, this is what my channel mainly focuses on, you must change that oil every 5,000 miles, even less on a turbocharged engine. 6 months, no more, even if you don't put the miles. Don't try to stay within these parameters, and it's extremely important on turbo engines. The second thing is warm it up and cool it down. Just like we talked about the importance of oil change intervals, you also have to think of that oil going into this turbo. See, oil goes on the shaft of the turbo to cool down the bushings or the bearings, and then to cool the turbo itself. When you start your car in extreme cold weather, Unlike modern gasoline engines that are not turbocharged, with turbocharged engines, even if you have super thin oil, you still got to give this engine a little bit extra time to warm up. And it's not for the engine itself. Look, modern engines warm up pretty quick, but the oil, you need to wait for that oil to actually warm up a little bit. Because when you have thick oil going to that turbocharger, it's just not going to flow so very well through these tiny little passages, and all of a sudden you floor this car, you're not going to have very good lubrication on that turbo, and that's what starts that premature wear on that, and things kind of go downhill from there. But if you must drive your car when it's really cold and you can't really wait to warm it up for whatever reason, really take it easy on this car until the oil warms up. See folks, you look at the coolant temperature, the gauge that you see on your car is the coolant temperature. It is not the oil temperature. Oil actually takes quite a bit of time to warm up when it's super, super cold. So warm it up. But more importantly than warm it up, cool it down. See, turbos spin at very high RPM, and in the opposite of the warm it up, when things are extremely hot and you've been driving kind of spiritedly or under load, or you came off the highway when you're really pushing high RPMs, that turbo is extremely hot. You shut off your car right away as soon as you came from this kind of high load driving in very hot weather. Oil flow immediately stops, and that oil is sitting in that very, very hot turbo is basically going to cook. Give it some time, and that repetition of cooking that oil is going to turn into sludge, and it's going to literally clog the passages going to the turbo, and then there it is. There's no more turbo, and we have major repairs ahead of us. You gotta let these cars cool down, folks. And if you can't, for whatever reason, I don't see a reason why you can't give your car a minute or two extra of your time to cool down. By cool down, I mean idle, let it idle for a minute or two, shut it off on high load, high temperature. If you can't do that, the last few miles leading up to your stop, really take it easy on this car. Just drive really low RPMs. And it's not about you flooring the car, RPMs. Especially if you drive a manual transmission, keep your RPMs down, because that is going to help that turbo cool down a little bit, so the oil flowing through it is not going to just sit in a very hot spot and cook. The third thing is, you gotta let the thing breathe. Turbocharged engines, they will go through air filters a lot more than your normal car. Now, air filter maintenance is important, but in regular gasoline, non-charged engines, you're not gonna go through a lot of air filter unless you live in a really dusty area. But you're gonna notice with your turbocharged engine, you're gonna go through a lot more air filters. And the reason for that is you have a lot more suction, because this turbo is pulling a lot of air and charging it into the engine. It's going to pull a lot of debris, a lot more than your usual car. And if you live in an area with sand, you really got to be on top of that air filter, because that air filter gets saturated with sand. Sand will destroy your turbocharger very quickly, and if it finds its way under pressure into your engine, it's really going to wreak havoc. Be on top of that air filter a lot more than your regular non-turbo engine. The fourth thing is, drive smart, not hard. Kind of like work smart, not hard. Don't be driving your economy turbocharged engine in your sensible family sedan or SUV like it's a race car. That's the first thing. The second thing, which is the smart part, don't be driving in high RPM, high load all the time just because, ooh, I have a turbo engine, it can handle the power and has all this power. Actually, keep your RPMs down in your normal commute, especially if you have a manual transmission. Always be in a lower gear, because even if you're just holding at high RPM, you're actually spinning these turbos unnecessarily. If you need to push the car because you need to pass somebody, or you're just flat out racing it, or however you want to drive it spiritedly, that's fine. But don't do that all day long, because you're actually overloading this turbo, or spinning it at very high RPM unnecessarily, heating it up, heating the oil, doing all this stuff. Take it easy on your drive with a turbo engine when you're just cruising. Don't cruise at high RPM, cruise at low RPM, especially in manual transmissions. And the fifth one, and the most important one, don't go fast and furious on your economy car. Folks, it is imperative that you don't get carried away with modifying your turbo car. Look, majority of us that watch car videos on the internet, we are car guys. We love the little things that everybody else really dislikes about cars. There is nothing cooler than a turbo car that every time you kind of push the clutch or let go of the gas, you hear that giant whoosh of the bypass valve releasing the excess pressure. That is the coolest thing for car guys. But don't go modifying your very sensible family hatchback or SUV to do that. And the biggest thing is, people who are into cars, they'll buy these normal cars and they'll want to, I want to hear the turbo, I want to hear it spooling, and they do make very cool sounds. But remember, these are not performance cars you are modifying. There are some of them that are, and you can do that. But the normal cars, they are not performance cars. They're actually not turbocharged for the sake of performance. They're turbocharged for the sake of having this tiny little engine that produces enough power for you to drive it and not feel like you have a very underpowered engine. So they're actually pushed to the max by default. That's just how they design cars these days. So these are the common modifications for turbos. You go put this aftermarket big air filter. Well, the first thing is you increased the flow of this turbocharger. And the second thing is that I see you put that cool bypass valve, or worse, a blow-off valve. What that does is, a bypass valve is okay because that's going to take the excess pressure and actually reroute it back. But a blow-off valve, in correct technical terms, will release that air to the atmosphere, not really recycle it. See, folks, most of these modern engines are not your old Supra. That's the bottom line. These modern engines, they have something called a mass airflow that meters how much air is going into the engine. So when it releases that excess pressure, that pressure is supposed to wrap around and go back, because that is called metered air. But when you release it to the atmosphere, you throw the computer off and it kind of starts from the beginning. Okay, I don't know what just happened. And repeated cycles of that is going to cause a lot of issues in this car. That's the first thing. The second thing, please don't go and, after you watch this video, don't go and put a manual boost controller. What that does is, it's a very simple device that manually controls how much pressure is this turbo producing. Folks, this was the coolest thing back in the day when, the 80s and 90s turbo cars. We used to do that. It's the easiest mod. You get a lot more power. Then 2 months later, you figure out why it was not a good idea. Do not modify the modern turbo cars because they're not your 90s cool cars. You manually interfere. These engines don't have room for modification. They're not meant for performance. They're meant for fuel economy and efficiency, not really for performance. You go increasing that pressure on that turbo, before you know it, you have a hole in your piston because things ran way too lean, because the injectors can't handle it, everything else can't handle it. You can't just have a magic, let's make more power, cheap thing. Don't modify modern turbo cars unless it's a performance car and you know what you are doing and you understand the risks of reliability issues. Don't go modifying the car even the slightest bit, because that is the #1 guaranteed way for you to have huge reliability issues. And then that sound, the whoosh sound, and the spooling sound becomes really not worth it. And lastly, folks, I have to discuss this and share with you my opinion on, are turbocharged engines less reliable than non-turbocharged engines? There will be essays written about this and how modern technology and modern oils have gotten here and there. The bottom line is, the more stuff you have on your engine, the more likely things will go south. That's the bottom line. Because if we look at it from a kind of a Stone Age perspective, there is more components, there is more stuff that's going to need service one day, one shape or form. But if we come back to the modern era, turbocharged engines operate at kind of a higher bracket of load. Let's put it this way. You are forcing air into this engine. You are putting pressure into this engine. Things will give. And that's the reality. Yes, turbocharged engines have come a very long way from the 90s and 80s, where they used to be just extremely horrendous. They've come a long way, but they are still you will always have oil consumption with turbo engines. There's just no way around it. That's just how this works. So going into a turbocharged engine, understand you're going to get the benefits. It's not all for nothing. You're going to get a small engine that is efficient, but it also have enough power to not feel underpowered. But understand that you're going to have to put more effort into the maintenance of it, into the care, to make it last. But eventually, every single turbo will fail at some point. I hope that point is long enough where you don't feel like we're barely at 100,000 miles and the thing is gone. Hopefully we get long times. If you follow some of the important tips that we talked about in this video, you will see high miles out of the original turbo. But eventually, something will happen and we're going to need to do something about the turbo or the associated components with it. So to answer this question, non-turbo engines will be more reliable long-term than turbo engines, but is the gap very wide? It is not very wide. It is actually shrinking as technology evolves and as things get better and better, and that is the God honest truth, folks. And to elaborate a little bit on the turbo engines will consume oil. In case that got your blood pressure up, turbos run at very, very high temperatures. That's just how they are. And even though they have seals, and these seals are supposed to hold the oil in, they never do. Find me one single turbo engine out there that when you take the turbo inlet or the intercooler or whatnot, you'll not see oil sitting there. They kind of exaggerate the blow-by because they have pressure. Their PCV system is always loaded. There will be some oil loss with turbo engines because the turbo itself will be blowing some of that oil straight into the intake and straight through the engine. It's not that the piston rings will start bypassing. No, the turbo itself will use some oil. We're not talking excessive amounts, but don't be going long. Well, we shouldn't be going long intervals with turbo engines, but if you do, you gotta check your oil because eventually it'll drop, and don't be surprised with a turbo engine if oil drops. That is just one of their natures, and that is the reason why turbo engines will one way, shape, or form use oil or consume it. And lastly, before we wrap up this video, I will talk about the very last thing, which should be obvious, but I want to make sure. If your turbo car takes premium fuel, your sure way of destroying that engine is putting non-premium fuel. If your car doesn't take premium fuel, there's absolutely no benefit in using premium. But if it does, you must use it with turbocharging because it will wreak havoc on the engine. See, regular cars, non-turbocharged that require premium, when you put non-premium, they'll be under power, they won't run very well, but it's not very catastrophic unless you keep doing it for a long period of time. But turbocharged engines, it is catastrophic, possibly very rapidly. And the reason for that is when you put regular gas in a car that requires premium, which has high compression, and you are under boost, which you are basically you have extra pressure coming in, detonation happens. And that, combined with the pressure of the turbo, creates the perfect condition for that piston to be melted or just break in half. Don't do that because that will not be a happy day. And then all the few bucks that you save over the life of the ownership of the car by putting regular gas will not be worth it. Please, if you own a turbocharged car, if it requires premium, put premium. If it doesn't, don't. And as simple as that. Folks, I hope with the rampant application of turbo engines, I hope everybody finds some use of this video, follows some of these tips, gets long miles without any issues from the turbo engines, and life is wonderful. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.